Interesting. Wow.
Well, along the lines of you saying people have a choice, it seemed to me in the first election that Donald Trump had, where it was him against Hillary, you just couldn't have a more career politician than her, and you couldn't have a more career businessman than him. And so it really was apples and oranges. And I think that the people that picked were the ones that lean either towards business, if you're a business person or owned a company, or if you just were tired of politicians, which I think he spoke to. My mother's a good example. My mom's never been in politics her whole life. She's 83, and she was wearing Trump shirts and going to rallies. And she just wanted something that wasn't what she perceived as the status quo of the way politics had always been. Do you think in your being around all this, is that really what Donald Trump did the most? He just totally disrupted the status quo of politics?
Yes, I think he came in and he turned over the tables and he broke the dishes. And that was why I liked him, because I felt that the system was so corrupt and so compromised by international globalism. I wanted someone to mess with it. I'd like to share with you something if I can. In studying these presidents, I've noticed something which I call the man in the shadows, and this applied to Trump, but it applies to many great Democratic presidents too. And that is, I've noticed again and again among presidential families that have written about that there's a very ambitious parent, usually it's a mother, and there's a target of that ambition. Usually it's the oldest son, but sometimes, like in the Bush family, it was a younger son, and in the Eisenhower family, it was a younger son. But this ambitious parent will pick that son and anoint them to be successful and promote them and favor them. And again, Tom and Steve, that son will die or will fail. I mean, it happened with the Kennedys. And there's another son who's in the shadows, who's looking on, who's a little envious, who thinks, why not me? I could do something great with my life, like Donald Trump. It was his brother who got all of the extra attention from his father and got all the positions, and Donald Trump was looking on with envy. There's a scene in one of my books where old Joe Kennedy is sitting in the car and it's snowing and freezing, and he's got the car heater on. He's talking to a buddy of his, and they're watching Jack Kennedy shake hands with men coming out of a factory. He's running for office. And old Joe Kennedy says, I never thought I'd see this in a million years. I always thought it was going to be Joe, the name of his oldest son.
Right.
I always thought Joe would do it. I never thought Jack would do it. I thought he was effeminate. It was the same in the Eisenhower family. It was all Milton. In the Bush family, it was all Jeb. I walked into the Oval Office one day and Barbara turned on me and said, you tell George not to run. This was in, 1990. He was considering running for governor of Texas. We don't want him to run, because they were afraid it'd mess it up for Jeb. They expected Jeb to do great things. In fact, that became public. She said, let's face it, George is too much like me. Jeb is like his father. We think Jeb's going to be able to do it. He's the politician. So I call it the man in the shadows. It's even biblical. You'll find it in the Bible where Jesse's father, the prophet Samuel, he meets all of Jesse's sons and he says, I can't figure out. I was sure it was one of them. Are these all your sons? Yep, these are all my kids. Well, there's David, he's out with the sheep, but he's the youngest one. Well, go get him. So they go get David. It's the man in the shadows. And I've just seen this. It's almost like God prowls the shadows looking for the son or the daughter that got passed over. And they're under no pressure. There's no parent saying, you got to get an A on this test. And in that relaxed atmosphere, they're able to develop and excel and do great things with their lives. I've seen that again and again among the presidents.
Fascinating.
I'm so glad you told that story, because I don't know if you remember this, Doug, but you told that story the time we were working in Mexico on that cruise boat with all those people. You told that story, and I followed you. I listened to you because I was backstage. I listened to you, and then I spoke, and I literally told that story what you just told. Of course, it's telling your third person, but all over the world, I've told that story for years, and I haven't heard you say that story in God, 20 years or 15 years or whatever it's been. So the Barbara Bush story with that she didn't want George W. to run. It's a great story, man. You can't follow Doug Wead on a stage. I followed him in Mexico. I followed him in Toronto and the States all over. You cannot follow. He is the best public speaker out there.
Wow.
He's just too good.
Well,
you're just too good.
The other thing that I've taken from this study of the president, Steve and Tom, that really stays with me is I was surprised when I wrote The Raising of a President, how abusive their parents were, how abusive Abraham Lincoln's dad, he'd knock him to the ground with his fists. He said he's lazy. All he does is read books. And he treated him awfully. And FDR had a mother. He wrote his brother and said, when he was 9 years old, I had my first bath without my mother. This was typical. A lot of these children who become president were abused in their childhood. And so when I studied that and I learned that, and they become president of the United States, I realized that the things that people do to us and say to us as children, they don't have to hold us back. We are not prisoners of what our mother did or our father did, or our brother, or some school teacher said about us. That's fake. We are free to do whatever we want in life and become whatever we want to become in life, because so many of these presidents, they become the president of the United States and they're abused as children. That was very liberating for me. And anybody listening to that, I think, should take that to heart. Don't use that as an excuse. You are not a prisoner of what happened to you in your childhood.
Wow.
Makes sense, yeah. You know, being around all these presidents, Doug, have you ever thought that you would ever want to do that someday? Or I always think to myself, who would want that job at any price? You know, I mean, what's your take on that? Is it an attractive position to you or not?
No, not at all. I guess I'm a chicken.
Yeah,
when you get into the arena like that, you really get slaughtered. It's quite a process. So no, I enjoyed. My role was to write about it.
Wow. When you walked in the Oval Office, and you walk in this room where history's been made so many times and times and times, what's the first thing that hit you when you got in there and you looked around? And were you thinking about all the other people that have been in there? Or were you thinking about meetings and events? Or what went through your mind?
Well, the first time I was in the Oval Office was I was on staff with the President of the United States. So I was under tremendous pressure to perform. So I didn't have the luxury of going in and saying, oh, this is nice.
Yeah, right,
all the
right.
things that happened. I was bringing in the president of the U.S. Olympic Committee, and the President of the United States was going to pitch him on the Atlanta Olympics, that America wanted to have the Olympics in Atlanta. So I had to write choreograph that whole thing. What would the president say? What was Samarachi going to say? And how could the president answer him? And I had to go through all that because the president doesn't have time for that. So I had to research and be prepared and anticipate everything Samarachi would say to the president and what the president should answer. So I was too busy in my mind to say, well, this is fascinating. This is the Oval Office. I was focused. But I did. Later, I did. When I went in to interview Trump, that was kind of fun because he's such a character. I walk into the Oval Office and Ivanka said, Dad, here's the guy that got us our jobs, Jared and I, our jobs on the White House staff. And he said, hi. And the president was holding up these papers above his head. And he looked at me and he said, these are my secret correspondence with Kim Jong-un. They didn't want me to let you have them, but I'm going to let you read them. You can't take them, but I'm going to let you sit down and read through this correspondence. So that was pretty exciting.
I bet.
That's amazing.
Talk about the inside scoop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Were you impressed with the correspondence?
Yeah, they actually set aside, I had lunch with the president, then they set aside a room for me to take my time to read through it. And it was very ornate. The Koreans are very formal and ornate, and they have ribbons and foils. inks and seals on their original documents, and they're in Korean, of course. And then there's the CIA translations in English underneath them. So it was very interesting to see this. And you could see that Kim and Trump had quite a relationship going on.
Wow. So overall, would you, I don't know, maybe I'm putting you on the spot with this, maybe I shouldn't ask you this, but I was going to ask you, of all the presidents you've known, who is the best in terms of authentic leadership, let's say? I mean, and I know you just wrote the book on Trump, so I know that's probably part of it, but.
Yeah, and I know that makes people angry and everything, but for my own reasons, I have to tell you, I'm deeply impressed with what Trump did and tried to do for the economy and for the Middle East. But I was very impressed with Ronald Reagan. There were limits to how far he would go, but he won the Cold War and he knew how to back off. He was a lot better politician than Donald Trump. But to give you one more insider example of Trump, when he came in, he asked Obama, what's the most serious problem we face? And Obama said war in Korea. And then he said, what's the biggest problem in the world? And they said, peace in the Middle East. So afterwards, he and Jared had a conversation about it. And I asked the president about it. I said, how were you able to move the American embassy to Jerusalem? I mean, 6 presidents before you promised to do that, and they didn't do it. Clinton said he was going to do it, and he made fun of his predecessor. George W. Bush attacked Clinton and ridiculed him and said, I'm going to do it on day one. Clinton promised, and in 8 years he didn't do it. I'll do it on day one. And he never did it in 8 years. So how was it when you came into power that you were able to move that? What did you learn that we don't know, that all these other presidents learned when they became president? He said, I'll tell you what it was. As soon as I became president, I got a call from Emmanuel Macron. He said, if you move that embassy to Jerusalem, there will be a war in the Middle East and 100,000 people will die. And I got a call from Erdogan of Turkey. He said, if you move that embassy, there will be war in the Middle East. And we know, we've already run the numbers, and there's been the military gains. 100,000 people will die in the Middle East if you do that. That's what will happen. So that's why all the other presidents backed down. So he said, why did you do it? He said, well, there are 2 things every president wanted: peace in the Middle East and to move the American embassy. That's what they wanted. And they said, we can't move the embassy because if we do that, we can't have peace in the Middle East. So they'd never move the embassy, hoping they'd have peace in the Middle East, which never happened. So I said, well, I'll move the embassy, and then at least I'll get one of them. And who knows, maybe I'll get peace in the Middle East too. So he moved the embassy and he pulled off the Abraham Accords, which was pretty remarkable. And that's typical Trump.
Wow.
That really is. Well, when you wrote this book, the Inside Trump's White House, the real story of his presidency, what do you think makes this the real story? Is this just the access you had to get the real scoop out of him?
Yeah, and out of the whole family. It's comical. There's a scene in the book where these beautiful women, Melania and Ivanka and Tiffany and Lara, and they go to the inauguration. They go to the event the night before at the Lincoln Memorial, and then they go to St. John's Church that morning, and then they go to the inauguration. They wear these 6-inch high heels. So they're going up these marble slippery steps of the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial, and where you have to take 2 steps to get one because they're so long, the steps, in these high heels. And then they have the parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, and the cars stop, and the ladies have to get out of the cars. They have to walk in their high heels for 500 yards down the street. And they finally get to the White House, and they go to the inaugural ball, and they slide all over the floors at the inaugural ball in their high heels, and they go to bed. And the next morning, they have one last event at St. John's Church. I'm sorry, the cathedral. And so it's not at St. John's, the National Cathedral. So they've got to go to one more event. They got to get into their high heels again. So they're all staying in the White House. And Laura comes down one of the hallways and she screams and says, "I can't get in my high heels. My feet are swelling." And you hear these screams all over the White House from all the other Trump women. It's the same thing. Their feet are swollen. So if you can picture this, here are these wonderful, beautiful women, and the butlers are bringing them big tubs of ice water, and they're sticking their feet in the ice water to try to reduce the swelling. So one more time, they can get into their high heels.
Wow.
That's the sort of thing you get in an insider book that you won't get in a history book where all the sources are anonymous.
Right.
Sure. Doug, what was your take on Mary Trump's book? I read that one. What was I know it's kind of the other side of the coin, but what was your take on that?
Well, I found it very interesting. I like to hear from everybody. There's always a family member who resents the president. There's a Billy Carter. He used to joke. He joked about it when Jimmy first started running for president. He had his sister, Ruth Carter Stapleton, who was a Pentecostal healing evangelist. So Billy Carter would say, "I got a sister who thinks she can heal people. I got a brother who thinks he's going to be president of the United States. I'm the only sane one in the bunch." That was Billy Carter.
And he had Billy Beer.
So-
Remember Billy Beer?
I do.
Yeah.
I think I might have had a couple cans of Billy Beer. Wow.
But there was Nixon had a brother who, well, look at Joe Biden's got a son that's kind of a rascal. And it's very common. FDR had a son who worked against him to try to get him voted out of office. He worked for the Hearst radio networks and had his own anti-FDR radio show. Ronald Reagan Jr. didn't like Ronald Reagan's policies, and Patty Reagan appeared for Playboy. So all through history, you have this, and I'm surprised that the Trumps have been as cohesive as they have. And they had to reach out to a niece that's really outside of the inner circle to get a critic.
Wow. Doug, what's your take on Jimmy Carter's legacy? Obviously, he's done so much outside of, after being the president. He's still going at, 97 or 96?
Right.
He lives not too far. We're in Atlanta. He lives not too far from here. But what's your take on his post-presidency?
Well, he's certainly one of the greatest, if not the greatest. And I think probably he is the greatest former president in American history, because others have done things, but he set the pace and scrupulously honest. And while presidents have made a fortune and set up foundations and it's turned into practically bribery, Jimmy Carter has been very clean. He was the last president before Trump not to have invaded somebody. He believed what he believed, and he didn't start wars. And as I mentioned before, he didn't start the Iran hostage crisis. That happened on his watch, but he didn't do the things that provoked it to happen, which is a big difference. But it's true that inflation reached 14% a month. If you can imagine that, people don't understand inflation and how it actually destroys their income and how devastating it is to the poor. But yeah, it's a tough thing.